Welcome to the S.M.I.L.E-ing Boys Podcast. This is a podcast that explores a public health approach to improving the mental health of Black boys while challenging the negative stereotypes often associated with this demographic in the society. This is a happiness research-informed podcast themed on the 8 pillars of happiness explored on my research trip to the top 5 happiest countries in the world. Now, isn't that cool?
Hello and welcome to another episode of the S.M.I.L.E-ing Boys Podcast. Today's episode would be on the pillar of happiness, which is health. And specifically, this episode we will be touching on mental health and how that in itself impacts the ways in which the young boys and ourselves navigate in the society in which we exist within. There's going to be different offshoot episodes on this particular theme. So today's episode would primarily be focused around mental health, how in this particular time it's a pertinent conversation that needs to be had, especially because we are also in the Mental Health Awareness Week. So it's important for us to actually delve into this particular concept at greater depth. As always, we're going to start with some research excerpts, and then I'm going to play you a series of audio clips from some young people around their own personal experiences around mental health and how we can then start to go in further detail into some of those themes throughout the episode. So research consistently shows that material, social, and racial disadvantages increase risk of poorer well-being and offending among young people growing up in the most deprived areas. Yet, many of those with mental health difficulties find that support is limited and hard to access. There's a lack of discussion and understanding around mental health in ethnic minority communities. So we now know from research that at age 11, African and Caribbean boys are not more likely to present with diagnosable mental health condition compared with their white peers. Yet, by the time they become teenagers and adults, they are many times more likely to be identified with severe diagnosable mental health conditions and more likely to end up in costly and restrictive mental health crisis settings. Young Black boys are also overrepresented in other areas of the system. They are more likely to be excluded from school and to be in contact with criminal justice system. There's evidence that daily inequalities and routine experiences of racism and discrimination, such as race-based bullying, being followed around the shop because you are believed to be a shoplifter, having to think twice about calling the police when others are in difficulty because of fear of ending up in the back of a police car, being exposed to media representations that are negative and messages that you are not good enough, struggling to access opportunities to move forward in life, have a weathering effect on well-being, leading to cumulative stress. So all of this research and data that I've just explored here can be found on the Mental Health Foundation page in the numerous reports exploring this particular theme of how mental health services and structures are disproportionately affecting young Black boys particularly. So in the 2016 report on the youth justice system in England and Wales, found that 40% of children are from BME backgrounds and more than 1/3 have a diagnosed mental health condition. So there's an intrinsic link there for sure. Black men are reported to have the highest rate of drug use and drug dependency than other groups, whilst white Caucasian population experience the highest rate of suicidal thoughts. Suicidal rates are higher among young men of Black, African, Caribbean backgrounds. Detention rates under Mental Health Act during 2017 and 18 were 4 times higher for people in the Black or Black British group than the white British group. So all these stats are really interesting and important for us to really kind of map into when we start to think about actually realizing that, yes, mental health is an issue that we all face, but there are specific elements within how this plays out in particular groups, especially BME, Black minority groups in our country. So it's really important to really zero in to the numbers and really start to see that there is a disproportionate effect on particular groups to be able to kind of hone into what we're going to explore much further. So we're going to talk a little bit more around exclusion and how that disproportionately impacts the mental well-being of young people. And the majority of the people who are excluded in the schools in this country are black boys. And also then we're going to kind of zero into the specific experiences some young people have had. So I'm going to play you a couple of clips about some young people exploring about their mental health in various capacities. And then we'll come back and explore what that looks like in our everyday lives.
There's been some tough times in my life here, and where I just listen to music and it's helped me it's helped me push myself through those times. So I can say myself because how strong I've been throughout my life and mentally. How you like to inspire other people. Me, what I want to do is see how I said I like doing music and see my music. But if I make music, then I want people to listen to it and see what I've been through. I want it to be in the lyrics, so they hear the lyrics and it can help them push through whatever they're going through. I know what they're going through. So yeah, like you, I just want to help people, inspire people to do my thing. I just want to make a difference to the world, because basically, kids that have depression and that, and they've committed suicide, all of that makes me angry. So that's why I want to make a change to that through music, because I know that that's helped me, the music and that listening to it, and it's made me think that I'm actually worth something, innit? So it's preventing me from doing all of that, and that's why I want to let people know that they are worth something. I want to let people know that they mean something to me.
Honestly, my mum passed away a few months ago, and it's the only person to me that kept me on the right track. When I came home late, she would let me in it. You know what I mean? She how do I put it? She looked after me with all of my heart. Obviously, when I was younger, and that no one else could pick me up except for my mum. The bond that we had together, was quite strong, and you get what I mean? Yeah.
That's really honest and very open. Thanks for sharing that.
In school, I can't talk to anyone about how I'm feeling, car. Not gonna let them understand.
Okay. Great. So we're going to explore in greater detail all these individual clips that have been kind of collated from these young black boys that have participated in the workshops and the sessions over the past year or so. So the first clip was one that really explored how a young person was able to articulate the issues that he's had, and how his, the tool he has used to navigate that is creating music, and really being able to talk about the challenges that a lot of other young people face and don't have an outlet, and how that is something that I think is really, really interesting to really start to think about. Because when we think about a lot of the evidence and statistics that show that actually there's a correlation between a lot of issues that young people face in terms of trauma or domestic violence or exposure to violence in some sort of capacity, how this impacts their mental health. And actually there is a correlation between the amount of young people who are being excluded based on challenging behavior. And challenging behavior, again, in this case, there's a correlation between some of the issues that happen outside of the school and the challenges and the traumas that these young people face, and how that manifests in challenging behavior. So when we start to see these connections, we start to realize actually that if schools are not actually specifically trauma trained, are not informed in mental health practices and how they need to be culturally aware and sensitive, and how to actually put things in place to support young people when they display a lot of these issues that are deemed, challenging behavior, and a lot of other mental health issues and diagnosed ones like ADHD, how there's much more a heightened proportion of those young people who are diagnosed ADHD who are black young kids. So realizing that there is already these systems in the society that actually disservice these young people, when we think about the percentage of young people who are excluded, who then fall into the criminal justice system, and seeing that there is a strong connection and a pipeline in that regard as well. So in this particular case, the question around that is about, firstly, just being able to marvel at the fact that this young person was able to articulate that. Because one of the biggest challenges, like I highlighted earlier, is the fact that within the black and minority ethnic communities, mental health is not something that's spoken about openly and readily. So for a young person within a group of 20 young black boys to be able to voice out some of the issues that he's faced around being able to keep himself in a positive space mentally, to acknowledge that some people have thought about suicide, and he has managed to navigate through those times, and he wants to use a platform like music to express himself and to support other young people like himself. And I think that's such a powerful state of heightened awareness for a young person to be able to identify that not only can he navigate a positive pathway out of these challenges, but actually use tools to also support other young people himself. So that's the one thing I just also wanted to kind of highlight and commend around the fact that actually, even though, yes, it's not something that's really spoken about a lot in communities, especially in that age group, I think what's really important is there are some young people out there who are much more in tune to this, and this needs to become commonplace. This needs to be something that is actually facilitated by institutions, by schools, to provide spaces where young people, especially gender specific groups, that actually young people can cultivate, which allows for them to have discussions that are open, to be able to talk about some of these challenges that they have, and then be signposted or provide resources for those young people to navigate themselves, either through creative means or through actual real services that are provided through NHS or through the local council or places like that, different professionals. So I think that's really important to kind of highlight that, and also to encourage young people to think about self-therapeutic ways in which they can actually express themselves. And that's why art is such a powerful tool. And obviously with the project that I deliver with these young people, one of the biggest parts of what we do is to be able to create a non-judgmental space where young people are able to open up and talk about things honestly, and actually be provided with the language to be able to articulate this, to give them the breadth of language to be able to articulate how they feel, and to think about how they can put things in place themselves. If you're an artist, or you want to express, or you want to take a walk, or you want to do all these simple things that can actually make a shift in the ways that they feel within those periods before actually seeking professional help if that's necessary. The second clip was one that a young person was talking specifically around an instance of loss in his life, where he lost one of the dearest people to him, his mother in that particular case, and how that was something that through the clip you could tell how deeply saddened this young person was. And in that period, this young person still had to go back to school. This young person still needed to perform in a classroom, in an environment that is heightened in pressure in terms of performance wise, in terms of behavior wise. And this young person still obviously in some cases lashes out and maybe gets angry because actually he's dealing with a lot of trauma. But within the school setting, there hasn't been things put in place for that particular young person's provision in terms of mental health counseling, in terms of other provisions to actually support this young person. So all of a sudden, this young person is seen to be acting out, or to be lashing out, or to be fighting, but actually not understanding that this young person is dealing and processing trauma, and actually things need to be put in place. These interventions need to be put in place instead of putting that child in isolation units, because actually that's not going to change or support that young person in navigating these traumatic events, this life-changing traumatic event. That's not going to help this young person. It's going to further isolate this young person. It's going to further other this young person as somebody who's difficult to deal with, who's got a challenging behavior, and somebody who's a disruption to the entire class. So actually just realizing that, these are real traumatic incidents and traumatic events that a lot of young people face, not just to this gravity, but in some cases in this way, but there's a lot of young people that have varying levels of trauma they have to explore and deal with, but still have to come into school and function. And actually realizing that a lot of schools, a lot of institutions don't put specific interventions in place to actually support these young people, realizing that actually instead of singling these young people out as young people who are just very difficult to deal with or have challenging behavior, realizing that there's a myriad of mental health issues that a lot of young kids are dealing with and still have to come into school and navigate that. And in some cases, that's very, very different to what most of their white counterparts have to deal with, which is why when you look at the performance levels of young Black Caribbean boys in comparison to a lot of other demographics, there is a marked shift, because in some cases there are these lived experience differences that actually account for a lot of the traumas and the incidents that they have to navigate outside of the school before they come into the school. And therefore these things impact their behavior. These things impact impact their ability to take in new information, to be able to perform at the levels where they are capable of performing outside of those other social factors. So it's important to really start to put those things in place and actually start to create specific intervention packages for young people instead of just excluding them just because we want to keep the numbers of the school's performance higher and other factors like that. The last clip which we played was a young person who talked about how he finds it difficult to express and explore these things in the school environment with anybody because they're not going to understand. And that's a key thing, because working with these young people, as I highlighted in a couple of episodes ago, one of the first things I do is building trust and building a safe space where young people are able to talk about things honestly without consequence and not judge, but just challenged in their thought process so they can actually start to introspect and think about what bits they have agency over. So with that, it's so important to be able to create spaces like that within institutions, especially institutions like schools, where young people do not feel like actually people are there to listen to them, do not feel that even when people do listen, they are able to empathize and actually believe in their true stories, not able to actually not demonize or victimize them with the information they have. So being able to identify that these things are so necessary and needed to be able to boost the overall well-being of young people by providing spaces where young people are able to express themselves without judgment, without punishment, and realize that what they're dealing with are valid emotions, they're valid feelings, they're valid fears, they're valid anxieties, and actually we're putting things in place as care providers, as people who have the responsibility and duty of care for these young people, to put these things in place to actually support them as opposed to chastise and consistently outcast them in our society. So when we think about the exclusion and how that impacts mental health, I'm going to explore some of the research around that, which have been commissioned by the Mental Health Foundation and a few key research bodies in the last couple of years. I guess the question is exclusion a positive measure when producing mentally well and thriving kids in our society? That's a question that's up for debate here. So research shows children who are excluded are more likely to develop a mental health condition than their peers who stay in mainstream education. A leading researcher told the Mental Health Education Foundation. Every year, 1,000 Black pupils are permanently excluded and nearly 30,000 receive a fixed period exclusion. Those are staggering numbers. Right? Black pupils are 3 times more likely to be excluded than their white peers, after all other background factors are taken into account. So that's super interesting, again, to see the disparity between Black pupils, particularly boys, and the white peers in terms of the exclusion rates and the percentage of exclusion in comparison. So it begs the question, when we start to think about the numbers that we talk about later in terms of after the ages of 11, there becomes a marked spike in the amount of Black teenagers and men who start to register diagnosable mental health conditions. And we start to think about the higher likelihood of detention rates under the Mental Health Act, which is disproportionately targeted and targeting Black boys and Black men when we think about those stats there. So they are 4 times much higher for people in the Black community to be sectioned under the Mental Health Act. So realizing that when we think about the amount of young people who are excluded, who are disproportionately Black, and in the exclusion rate, the percentage of young people who go from exclusions to the criminal justice system is overwhelmingly so. So over 40% of children are from BME backgrounds who have been in the criminal justice system in our current time at the moment. And how many of those are diagnosed with mental health condition? Over 40% of those too. So realizing that as a society, there are intrinsic factors within our system, within our caregiving, which is inevitably biased towards young Black kids and Black men in particular, realizing that these things have been evidenced through lots of research, but what is stopping a lot of change and implementation? We're still looking at, isolation units in schools. That's supposed to be something that should be widely known now, that actually it's not positive for the mental well-being of young people, but yet there has been a lot of very sneaky ways of rebranding the isolation units and calling them alternative provisions and calling them meditation rooms and all these other things where there's no meditation happening in there. These young people are just thrown in there and just told to just do their work, or just told to face a wall and just do some work and sit in isolation. These things have been proven through a lot of research and evidence to have a very negative impact on this young person's mental well-being. But yet these are still things that are quite frankly deployed in lots of schools at the moment. So it's really important for us to really start to critique these institutions and the ways in which we actually put things in place to support young people when we talk about mental health. And it's really great to see that in some cases, Ofsted have specifically put things in place in their, regulation documents around how mental health should be a key part of their measurement in schools. But yet, there's so many loopholes in which schools tend to get out of this. And it's a very important thing that we need to be actually fighting for at a greater ferocity. So some recommendations that have come through from a lot of mental health research reports have been, so local authorities, NHS commissioners, police and other school pool budgets to offer long-term funding to community-based targeted services and projects which support marginalized young people. So it's really important that all these independent bodies like the NHS, like the police, like the schools, put their resources together to actually provide community targeted interventions for young people. And for that to happen, this has to be a pooled effort. This cannot be, the local community is doing this, the NHS is doing this, the police is doing this. What tends to happen is, these different bodies are trying to make themselves look good. So they put so much money into something that's not targeted and it's not specifically community driven. So therefore, they're putting money into the hands of people who are trying to do a blanket approach, but actually nothing is being done. And the people who are really on the ground making the work happen, who are specifically trusted by these demographics and have a long history of making research-led approaches in this community, intelligence-driven approach into these communities, are not being given the funds or don't have the consistency of funds to keep these work happening within the community. So that's a big kind of recommendation that needs to be taken on board for sure. Schools need to be psychologically informed with staff who are trained in understanding and addressing trauma, stress, and distress, and life lessons on their curriculum. So this is really important in terms of having teachers who are trauma trained, teachers who are well versed in understanding how stress impacts young people, especially young boys, and how these things actually interplay in other antisocial behaviors that might lead from the ways in which actually these young people are cared for without putting these things in place. So therefore, these things then start to show themselves in lots of other symptoms, which violence is one of those. So really understanding that, these things are also the responsibility of the school, the teachers, the institutions that are supposed to take care of these young people, to actually have very specifically trained staff members who can understand, empathize, and put the right things in place to support these young people through these times. Again, prisons need a profound culture shift to prioritize well-being and rehabilitation in order to stop the cycle of offending. I know this is a debate in itself, whether prison is punitive or it should be rehabilitation driven. Obviously, the whole idea of prison in itself is to bring out a citizen that hopefully is able to be reintroduced into the society and have a positive impact in the society. And what we should be doing while they're in there is providing the tools for them to come out and stay out and be a positive addition to the economy and the society as a whole. So for us to do that, it's important that we drastically readdress what happens while they're in there. I work, I've done projects in the prison, and I work with these young people who are having debates with prison officers about why they feel like they should be rehabilitated in here. Prison officers are telling them, well, you committed a crime, so you should be in here banged up 24 hours a day. And how does that make any sense? These young people in there, they're young people. So there's people in the Youth Offending Institute who are, 15, 16, 17. So cognitively, they're still developing. So whatever it is they did or the crimes they committed, they were still children. So it's the whole point of providing an opportunity for these young people's behaviors, their thought patterns to change. There needs to be actual investment in the kind of care that they get while they're in there, the kinds of research driven, the kinds of interventions, the kinds of counseling that needs to be happening in that space to bring about rehabilitation, to change the culture of violence in that environment, because those things are deeply rooted in traumatic thought patterns, because these young people are used to one way of expressing those emotions, and because they're already dealing with trauma, so therefore understanding that you need to be putting things in place to actually change the trajectory of these young people, because if not, we might as well just cast them out for doom. If you're putting them in there and not putting any counseling or any mental health driven interventions in there to support these young people, then they're going to come out being even worse. They're going to come out being worse off than when they were in there. And that does not spell good news for the society as a whole. So that's one of the things that I think is really important to actually start to really think about wherever you stand in this idea of rehabilitation of punishment, because both things can exist. You can go into that place as a punishment because you're being removed from the society and your family. But ultimately, while you're in there, there also needs to be things that are put in place to actually support your mental well-being and your mental health. And that's a very big conversation, a big debate in itself. And that's something that we can have in a different episode. Having more positive male role models who are open about mental health, modeling resilience and vulnerability is a big thing, especially when we think about the Black community. When we think about how many people are vocal about having mental health challenges, and this idea of resilience almost could be a double-edged sword around this idea that you just deal with things, you just keep it moving. And that's something that is plagued our society and plagued our community for a long time, because Black communities have, been heralded as one of the most resilient, and we've come through a lot of adversity in various ways. And therefore, because of that, this is a minor thing. My parents came on your ancestors came on a boat, or your parents were here and they were, doing, the worst jobs, and, immigrants trying to do this. So therefore, you dealing with whatever it is you're dealing with is so menial in comparison. So hearing a lot of Black male role models, or just Black role models particularly, but I think with boys it's important that there's this mirror of male that we look at and think, oh, if this guy that comes from similar environment like me can come out and talk about the fact that he's dealing with depression, which is one of the greatest things when we think about people like Dave, people like Stormzy, people like Danny Rose, who's an athlete, who's come out and talk about a lot of the challenges that they faced and they consistently face in their mental health. Even though on paper people look at these people as very successful and people who are doing really well in their respective careers, actually debunking this myth that actually those people cannot still have mental health issues. And actually what that does is empowers young boys to look at them and think, actually, I thought this guy was having a great life. He's got cars, he's got women, all of these things, or he's got a girlfriend, family, whatever, and think those people can still be struggling with mental health issues. People like Professor Green, talking a lot about, his mental health depression that he's had, he's losing his father to suicide. A lot of all these things have really been an important watershed moment in masculinity and in actually debunking the idea of mental health in males, but also within the Black community specifically. So more of this will be an important way to really slowly make mental health less of a taboo subject and actually provide a gateway for young people to talk about these things much more openly and much more safely. Another thing that's really important is, as I said before, creating spaces that are gender specific to support young people and people generally to express openly. So what I am really lucky to be a part of is it's a group called the Mandem Group, and that's been such an incredible group where a bunch of men from different backgrounds all together in a WhatsApp group, and we tend to have meetups and link ups and watch a film that is around masculinity, and then we talk about the film but also openly talk about things that we're dealing with. And it's been such a healthy addition to my life. It's such an important thing that I would recommend that most people start up a group, be part of a group where you're able to openly talk about things, be able to share things that's on your mind, things that you're worried about, feeling like you're not alone in that. I think that's one of the most powerful things as human beings when we think about, togetherness and belonging, being able to open up and talk about things to people that are going to not make you feel bad for being honest and open, whatever those things are. So that's really, really important. So changing the negative media portrayal of Black boys as often negative and dangerous victims or perpetrators of violent crimes. That's really important because the study shows that more exposure to these narratives of yourself creates a self-fulfilling prophecy that therefore impacts your mental well-being, because you are being told you're not good enough, you're being told you're dangerous, you're being told you're a criminal. So actually you are consistently faced with this narrative of yourself that you have to consistently challenge or fall into. So actually, as a society, we need to take responsibility for how we portray young Black boys, which is one of the reasons why this project is so powerful, in that the first thing that you will hit with is the media representation being challenged of this demographic of young Black boys smiling, not as menacing characters, not as drug dealers, not as weapon carriers, just as youthful, effervescent, cheeky, smiling faces of Black boys. And it's really important that in our everyday lives, we need to address these stereotypes and perceptions and ill-perceived ideologies of young black boys, because that's not a singular narrative, and we need to be responsible collectively and individually about how we feed into these purported messages and ideas of young black boys. So that is generally some of the main key points around what we were going to explore around mental health today. There's so many other ways in which, we could do a 2-hour episode on this, but I think it's important that we keep it in, sizable chunks where we can then kind of do series of episodes. So I would really, really love to hear anyone share how you choose to improve your own mental health in your everyday life, the simple tools that you use, and hopefully we can kind of collate a lot of these things that work for you and work for different people, and just kind of have some resources that are available for a lot of people to kind of think of what potential ideas that might be able to work for them and who they are. So thank you guys so much again for listening. And this is again Mental Health Awareness Week. So I hope that everybody is much more aware of their mental health in their everyday lives, especially in COVID. I think we're going to do a different episode around how COVID and mental health interplays in our lives, and especially within young people's lives at the moment. But in the interim, I think it's important that we are very cognizant of the things that are happening in our everyday lives, how we can best put things in place to improve our own mental well-being in our everyday lives, from a tangible, small-scale thing to a macro thing in a society. So thank you guys so much for tuning in, for adding your thoughts and your comments. I'd like to hear and see more of those. So please do that. Share, rate, listen, subscribe on multiple channels that we are broadcasting on. And again, it'll be really great to hear from certain people around various ways in which some of this work that I'm doing can really feed into some of your institutions, feed into some of the organizations that you work in, and how this could really form an interesting bridge to us providing specifically designed care packages for young people, especially in these times moving forward. So we don't want to stay in a world that we had pre-COVID. We want to move into a world that is shaped to benefit everybody equally, and that's what we are trying to work towards. And I would love to hear from people who are on this mission to continually create a much more equal and much more unified structure in the world that we're living in. Thank you guys so much. Much peace and love. Catch you on the next episode. Peace.